Hello everyone. In this lesson, we will begin implementing live search results. So for example, if someone comes to our website and they know exactly what they're looking for, instead of clicking on one of our links, we want them to be able to use the search icon up in the top right corner of our header. Right, so if someone was interested in biology, they should be able to click this icon and then just type in the word biology. So that makes sense, but you might be wondering, what does live search results mean? What does the word live mean in this context? Well, to answer that, let me show you an example of the opposite of live search results. So in this tab, this is an empty demo separate WordPress site using the default 2017 theme. And here we see the default search box. And if I click onto that and begin typing in biology, absolutely nothing will happen until I either press enter on my keyboard or click the submit button. Now the opposite of this behavior is live search results. Live is just another way of saying real time or on the fly or in the moment. Live search results would be as soon as I'm typing in biology and maybe just a couple hundred milliseconds after I type in the final letter and then pause for a second, we would then immediately be presented with the results for that search query right about here. Or if I backspaced and typed in math, just a couple hundred milliseconds after I stopped typing, we could see the results for that search query right here, without having to press enter or submit the form, right? Because with this traditional way of searching, if I want to search for math, I actually have to submit this form. It refreshes my browser, takes me to an entirely different URL, and only then can I finally see the results for that search. Now, I don't think that traditional search results like this is terrible, and we will learn how to set this up as a fallback later on in the course. But I do think that live, real-time, on-the-fly search results can create a more engaging user experience. So that's what we're going to set up as our first preference. Right? When someone clicks this search icon in the top right header of our website, what I want to do is open up a full screen, semi-transparent overlay or light box with a text input field that the user can begin immediately typing into. And then a couple hundred milliseconds after they stop typing, we can present them with the search results in real time. So how can we make this happen? Well, let's talk about programming languages. So in this case, PHP cannot help us. Right? PHP is great at initially outputting the page that we want to load, but once the web browser has loaded the page, if we want to make any changes without completely refreshing the page, we need to use the JavaScript language. Right? JavaScript is how we can manipulate the page in real time. So right now, why don't you and I begin writing a bit of JavaScript? So let's open up our text editor, and in our theme folder, let's look within the JS or JavaScript folder, and then I want you to open up the scripts.js file. Now, before we worry about creating our live search results, why don't we first just make sure that our JavaScript file is working? So just as a test, maybe down at the very bottom of this file, why don't we create an annoying temporary alert message, so alert and then parentheses, and within it, let's say quotations, this is a JavaScript test. And then if I save the file and refresh our website, you'll notice that I do not see a pop-up message. And that's because we just edited the file named scripts.js, but WordPress is loading in the file named scripts-bundled.js. So we need to go the extra step and bundle or compile this file, so that this updated code that we just wrote will live inside the bundled file that WordPress uses. Now this extra step of bundling and compiling our JavaScript and breaking everything down into individual module files, this is completely optional and it has nothing to do with WordPress. You don't have to set up your JavaScript like this. I'm doing things this way because I want you to gain as many valuable skills as possible, and writing modular JavaScript like this is very important to a lot of employers and dev teams. But I do want to stress that you do not need to use my JavaScript setup if you really don't want to. If you would rather write all of your JavaScript for the entire website in the one file that WordPress is loading, that's a-okay. You might not stay as organized if you do things that way, but you can avoid the whole process of needing to compile or bundle your JavaScript. Okay, but having said that, this is the way we're going to be doing things in the course, because I feel the pros outweigh the cons, and also just because this is the industry standard. So the question now is, how do we bundle up our JavaScript? Well, we've already done it a few times in the course, but let's review again. We begin by jumping over to a command line, and be sure to cd for change directory into the folder where your WordPress files live, right? So in my case, that's Fictional University, and this folder where these 4 important files live, the webpack config, settings.js, package.json, and gulp file.js. Okay, and once your command line is pointing towards the folder where these files live, then you can either run gulp scripts to perform a one-time bundle or compile of your JavaScript, or if instead you run gulp watch, that will spin up the local preview proxy server of your website, and more importantly, it will watch your JavaScript file for any saved changes. Right, so back in our scripts file where we wrote this is a JavaScript test message, if I save this file again, you can see the command line automatically starts bundling up the file for me. Right, so back in our text editor, that command that we just ran uses a popular tool named Webpack, and it bundles up all of these individual files that we listed into a single file, a file named scripts-bundled. So if you opened up the bundled file, you would see that it's just this huge, difficult to read for us as humans, but easy to read for a web browser. So now if we go back to our website and refresh, we do indeed see the annoying alert pop-up that says this is a JavaScript test. Okay, so at this point we've got our JavaScript game up and rolling. Now back in our text editor, we don't actually want to alert out that test message, so let's delete that. And instead, why don't we learn how to create a brand new separate module file dedicated to our live search results? So let's create a new file in this modules subfolder that lives inside our JS folder. So inside this modules folder, let me create a new file. The name of this file does not matter, but just to make sense, why don't I name it search.js? And in this course, we are going to be writing object-oriented JavaScript. Again, this is optional. You don't have to write object-oriented code. This has nothing to do with WordPress. It's just my own personal preference. But it's a very popular way of doing things in the professional dev world. And I think that you learning how to write object-oriented modular code is only going to help your career. Okay, so let's begin by creating a class named search. So class, and then the name of our class. You could name it whatever you want. Let's go with search. Okay, and then we add in some curly brackets. And then in JavaScript, whenever we create a class, we want to be sure to include a constructor function. So we just type out constructor. It's a special reserved word in JavaScript. And then parentheses, curly brackets. Okay, and then any code that we place within the constructor function will be executed as soon as we create an object using our class or blueprint. Remember, a class is just a recyclable blueprint that we can use to create multiple objects using this recipe. Now, instead of worrying about actually building the live search results functionality right in this moment, instead, just as a quick example and test, within our constructor function, why don't we alert a pop-up message that says, hello, I am a search. All right, and let's pretend that we are now done creating our class. And now we want to be able to import and use it within our main scripts file. So back in our search.js file, down at the very bottom of this file, we can just say export default and then the name of the class, search. And this line of code will allow us to import this file into our main scripts file. So check this out. Let's go ahead and save this file. And then back in our main scripts file, in this section of code, why don't we import in that new search module? So new line, let's say import search from, and then we just provide a path that points towards the new search file. So we've got single quotes, and we'll say // to look inside the current folder, right? So the scripts file lives right here. And then we just want to look inside this subfolder named modules. So let's say modules, look inside that folder, and the name of the file is search. You don't need to include the .js. We just need the actual file name, search. All right, and now that we've imported that file and class, we can actually use it to create a new object. So down here, let's add a new line, and let's create a variable and name it magical search. The name doesn't matter, I'm just making up a temporary name. And let's set it to equal a new instance of our search class, right? A class is just a blueprint that you can use to create new instances or new objects. Now, as soon as I save this file, our command line will automatically rebundle up our JavaScript, and we can see that our preview proxy server automatically refreshed and says, hello, I am a search. Let's click OK. Now, back in our text editor, we created one object named magical search, but remember, classes can be reused. So we could create another variable or another object and name it amazing search, and also tell it to equal a new instance of the search class. And if we save this, I think you can imagine what will happen. We see one pop-up, hello, I am a search, and if I click OK, we see a second pop-up, hello, I am a search. So the idea here is that we create a reusable blueprint or class, and it gets to live in its own neat, organized, separate file. And then once we import that file, we can use it as many times as we want to create different objects or variables. Now, in reality, in this instance for our website, we don't need multiple search objects. We are only going to have one single search object. I only did this to remind you what a class is, right? A class is a potentially reusable blueprint. The code that lives within a class doesn't actually get executed until you create an object that uses that class as a blueprint. Okay, so let me go ahead and delete the second search. And then let me rename the first search to just simply search. The naming doesn't matter, but this will look a bit cleaner for us. Let's go ahead and save that. Okay, so now we're just back to the one pop-up. And really quick, if you are not using our modular setup, meaning you're not splitting your JavaScript up into a main file and then a module file, you might be wondering how you can leverage classes like this. Well, let me walk you through it. So if you are indeed following along and using my separate file modular pattern, you can ignore the next minute or two. But if you want to skip the whole modular bundling step, and you just want one big JavaScript file with all of your code in it, you don't need this export line. So you could delete that, or I'm going to comment it out. And instead, you can just go ahead and create a variable, amazing search equals new instance of search class. Right? You can indeed do all of this in a single file like we see here. In modern web browsers, this code will work just fine. You create your class, and then you can create objects that leverage the class. And in that case, you wouldn't need to bundle up or compile the file. You could literally just load this file in the web browser. So you could go into the WordPress functions.php file, and instead of loading in the scripts-bundled file, you could just load this search file that lives inside the modules folder. Okay, now having said that, I'm going to delete this line and then uncomment this because I am indeed going to use the modular setup where each class lives in its own individual file. And I strongly encourage you to follow along with me. Now that's actually going to bring this lesson to a close. Now that we are all on the same page and we've got our JavaScript rolling, in our next lesson we will actually begin writing out the code to power live search results. This should be a lot of fun. There's the potential to learn a lot about JavaScript. So let's keep things rolling, and I will see you in the next lesson. Hello everyone. In this lesson, we are going to work on opening and closing our search overlay. So in other words, when someone clicks on this search icon in the top right corner, we want to respond by opening up a full screen semi-transparent overlay with a text field where users can begin typing in what they're looking for. Now, in order to respond to the event of this icon getting clicked on, we will need to write JavaScript. But before we write that JavaScript, let's first write the HTML that will control what the overlay should look like. So check this out. Follow along with me. Over in our text editor, within our theme folder, I want you to open up footer.php. Let's scroll down to the very bottom, and right before the closing body tag and this WP footer line, right above that, let's create a brand new div, and let's give this div a class of search-overlay. Okay, and then within that div, just as a test, let's say hello 123. Now if we save that and refresh our website, we don't see anything. Whoops, here's our search JavaScript test from the previous lesson, but you'll notice that we don't see the hello 123 anywhere towards the bottom of the page. And that's because I've written CSS that targets this class, and it will hide this div unless we give it another class of search overlay --active. So the overlay is hidden by default, and then if we add this class, it becomes visible. So as soon as we save this and refresh, now you can see this semi-transparent overlay, and we see hello 123. So what we're going to do is let the search overlay be hidden by default, and then we can add this class to it dynamically with JavaScript. So let me show you what I'm talking about. Once someone clicks on this search icon in the top right, we can then use JavaScript to add this secondary class in real time. Okay, and then once someone has that full screen overlay visible, what if they want to close it to go back to the regular part of the page? Well, within the overlay, let's add a few things. Instead of hello 123, let's add a text field where users can type in what they're searching for. And let's also add a large X icon that you can click on to close the overlay. So within this div, let's add another interior div. And let's give this div a class of search-overlay __ top. Okay, and then within that new div, let's create one more div with a class of container. And anything that lives within this div will be horizontally centered on the screen. Okay, and now within this container div, let's first create a text field where users can type what they're searching for. So input, and let's give it a type of text. And just for CSS styling, let's give it a class of search term. And why don't we give it a default value? So placeholder equals. So when you first see the field, it already reads, what are you looking for? And then while we're at it, why don't we also give this input an ID of search term, so that way later on we can have a unique hook to look for with our JavaScript. Okay, so if we go ahead and save this, that creates the full screen overlay with this top portion that's a slightly different color. We've got an input field, and if you click on it, you can start typing. Next, let's add a large search icon right about here, and let's add a large X or close icon right about here. So back in the text editor, right before the input, let's create an I element. Since we are using the Font Awesome library, this is how you can create an icon. Let's just give it a class of FA for Font Awesome, and then give it another class of FA-search. Okay, so that will pull in the Font Awesome magnifying search icon, and then let's give it another class that will give it the right color and also the right positioning. So let's say search overlay __ icon. And then whenever you create a Font Awesome icon, you also want to add another attribute instead of class named area hidden. And let's set that to equal true. So this way, if someone comes to our website and they don't have perfect vision and they are using a screen reader, it will not try to read this element out loud to that visitor. Let's go ahead and save that. Okay, cool. There's the large search icon. Now let's just add the X or close icon over here. We can actually just copy and paste this I element. So copy it into our clipboard. And then right below this input element, just paste in your clipboard. And instead of FA-search, let's change that to FA-window-close. And then let's change this class from search overlay underscore underscore icon to underscore underscore close. Let's give that a save. Cool. Now at the moment, if we click the close icon, nothing happens because all we've done so far is write a bit of boring HTML. But you can imagine that we want to use JavaScript so that when you click this close icon, we remove this active class from the search overlay so then it becomes invisible again. Okay, now at this point, now that we've got this basic HTML skeleton complete, let's go ahead and delete the active class, right? So the search will be invisible by default on page load. And right now, let's begin writing JavaScript to make the opening and closing of this dynamic. So in our theme folder, let's look inside the JS folder and then the modules subfolder, and let's open up search.js. Now I want to begin by giving you an overview of how I approach object-oriented JavaScript. I like to break everything down into three main sections or three main areas. So follow along with me and type this out. The constructor function is area number 1, so let's add a comment just to stay organized, right? Comments are just notes to ourselves that the computer won't actually run. So we'll say section number 1, the constructor is where we describe our object, or I should say describe and create or initiate. Don't worry, we will review what this means a bit later on. But the constructor is section number 1, and then right below the constructor function, I like to have area number 2, and this is where I list all of my different events. So an example of an event would be when this top right search icon gets clicked on, or when the search overlay's big X icon gets clicked on, right? Each of those would be an event, and we want to be able to respond to those events. Okay, and then section number 3 is where our methods will live. A method is just another way of saying a function or an action. It helps to think of our methods as verbs, right? Action words. So before we even write any real code, we can go ahead and write a few skeleton methods, right? Because we know that our search overlay needs to be able to open up and reveal itself, and it also needs to be able to close down or hide itself. So why don't we create one method or function named open overlay? Okay, and then right below that, we could create another method named close overlay. Now we are creating a search object, but if you imagined we were creating a person object or a human being object, the actions that a human being can perform would live here, right? Things like run, jump, walk, speak. Okay, and to continue with that metaphor of creating a person or human being object, the constructor is where we would define things like the person's name or their eye color, right? So instead of this alert test message, in the constructor function, we could create different properties about the object. So we would say this to refer to the current object or person, and then we can go inside it with a period and then create whatever property names we want. So we could say name, this dot name equals Jane. And we could say this dot eye color equals green. And maybe this dot head equals some sort of object that creates a human head. And this dot brain, some sort of object that creates a human brain. Okay, so the constructor is where you create and describe and sort of give birth to your object. And then the events area is where you connect the dots between your object and the different actions that it can perform. So for an example of an event, I'm not going to write any real JavaScript, but let's just write pseudo fake code in plain English. We might say, on the event that this dot head feels cold, maybe we respond by running a method named where's hat. And then you could imagine that down here we would have a method named where's hat. So the events area is sort of like the dispatcher, or it's the main central office that takes an incoming event. Maybe if the head of someone feels cold, you respond by putting on a hat. Or another example would be on this dot brain feels hot. Maybe you respond by going swimming. Okay, and then that calls or dispatches our method named going swimming. Okay, now that's enough with our person or human metaphor. Let's get back to the real world, where what we want to do is respond to the event of this top right icon getting clicked on. So back in our code, let's delete all of this human person metaphor code. So I will delete the name, eye color, head, and brain in the constructor. And then we can also delete these two fake event lines. And let's delete the going swimming and where's a hat method. And let's begin up in the constructor by selecting this icon element. So back in our code, inside the constructor, let's create a property about this object. So let's say this dot, and then we can make up a property name. Let's call it open button equals, and then we just want to point towards this element. Now, selecting an element with JavaScript is simple enough, but we are actually going to leverage a library named jQuery to make it even easier. jQuery is no longer the cool kid on the block, so I wouldn't necessarily use jQuery on every single new project, but considering the nature of this fictional university website, I think jQuery is a decent fit and will save us a lot of extra coding in the long run. So back in our editor, if we want to use the jQuery library, what we can do is just up at the very, very top of this file, we can say import $ from single quotes jQuery. If you've been following along and you're using my modular setup, this is all we need to include in order to use jQuery in our code. If, however, you are not using my modular setup and you're skipping the entire bundling and compiling step, let me show you how you can load jQuery the official WordPress way. What you can do is go into functions.php and you just want to tell WordPress to load jQuery. Now the way you can do this is scroll down to our university files function, and remember this is where we told WordPress to load in our JavaScript file. In my case, I'm loading in my bundled file, but you might be loading in whatever file you want. But the key here is the dependency argument. So I have it set to null because my script doesn't depend on anything else, but if you wanted to load jQuery, you could replace null with array, and then inside the array just say jQuery. And WordPress will take care of attaching the jQuery JavaScript library for you. But again, if you're using my modular bundled setup, you do not need to do that, and you can just leave this set to null. In fact, you don't even need to come into this functions file right now at all. Okay, so back into our search JavaScript file, we want to use jQuery to select this top right search icon. So what we can do is $ to begin using jQuery, parentheses, quotes, and then we can just use a CSS-like selector to select the element, meaning a dot for a class or a hashtag for an ID. Now I can tell you that that top right icon has a class of js-search-trigger. Let's drop down to a new line, and next let's select the close icon that exists in the search overlay. So this dot, we can name the property whatever we want. Let's call it close button. And then we want to select that close icon, so we can use jQuery to select an element. And I can tell you that the X icon has a class of search-overlay__close. Okay, and let's create one more property for now. Let's say this dot search overlay, right? Let's select the actual div that we want to add and remove the active class to hide and show the div. the div that we added to our footer at the beginning of this lesson. So jQuery to select it, and it has a class of search-overlay. All right, now at this point, we've got all of the different properties that we need. Now let's go ahead and connect the dots between these elements, the events of them getting clicked on, and then the appropriate methods that we want to respond with. So in our events section, let's create a method named events. So events, parentheses, curly brackets. And within these curly brackets, we want to be on the lookout for two events. The first is when the open button element gets clicked on, and the second event is when the close button gets clicked. So let's start with the open button first. So we can say this.openButton, right? That will select the element that we have stored in this property. And then we can just say .on, and then the jQuery on method takes two arguments. The first argument is the event that we want to be on the lookout for. In this case, it's the click event. And then the second argument is the name of the function or method that you want to call in response. So when this button gets clicked, we want to fire our open_overlay method. So to point towards this method, we just say this to refer to the object, and then dot, and then the name of the method. So open_overlay. Now before we write the actual code for these methods, let's just go ahead and write the other event line for the close button. So new line, let's say this.closeButton, and on the event that it gets clicked on, what do we want to do? We want to fire our close_overlay method. So this.close_overlay. All right, now that we've spelled out those two events, let's actually write the code that adds and removes the active class to the search_overlay div. So in our open_overlay method, let's begin by targeting our main search_overlay div. So this.search_overlay, and we just want to add a class to it. So add class is a jQuery method or function, and then we just provide the name of the class. So remember, it's search-overlay --active. And then for the close_overlay method, we can just do the same thing, but reverse it. So let's copy and paste this line, copy it, paste it into close_overlay, except this time we don't want to add a class, we want to remove a class. So just change this jQuery method name to removeClass. All right, now before we save this and test it out, there's only one last thing we need to do. We want the web browser to be on the lookout for these events as soon as the page is loaded, or in other words, as soon as our object is created or born. So within the constructor, let's just call the events method. So we can just say this.events, parentheses to actually call the method or function, and that will make sure that these event listeners get added to the page right away. Okay, now at this point, let's save this file. But remember, we need to bundle up or compile our JavaScript. So over in a command line, make sure you cd or change directory into that folder that we referenced in our previous lesson. And then you can either run gulp scripts for a one-time compile, or you can run gulp watch. And then as soon as you save a change to a JavaScript file, that will trigger a rebuild or rebundle. And then if you go back to your browser, you might need to perform a hard refresh. But now if we click on this icon in the top right, whoops, that's actually not working yet. I know what the problem is. Back in our text editor, in our events section, by default, the jQuery on method, when it calls the method name that we list here, it's going to change the value of the JavaScript keyword this. So then in our open and close overlay methods, when we are saying this.search_overlay to try to target that main div, we think the keyword this is referencing our main object, right? The object that contains these properties. But the on method changes the value of the this keyword to point towards the HTML element that got clicked on. So what we can do to solve this confusion is right after we list the name of the method that we want to call, we can just say .bind, which is a function, and then just include this as the value. So .bind this. Okay, let's go ahead and save this and test it out. So now when I click the top right search icon, cool, and if I click the close icon, perfect. That's going to bring this lesson to a close. In our next lesson, we will keep on rolling with the JavaScript. Hello, everyone. In this lesson, we are going to continue working on our search overlay JavaScript. Let's dive right into the action. So the first thing that I want to work on or address is when someone opens up the search overlay, you'll notice that just barely behind this transparent layer, you can see the main web page in the background. And notice that I'm still allowed to scroll up and down, and you can see the page in the background reflecting that. Now, I think that's potentially very awkward or confusing for visitors of the website. So what I want to do is, as soon as you open up the search overlay, I want to remove the ability to scroll the main page. Now, I've already written a CSS class that we can add to the main body element to achieve just that. So let's go ahead and use JavaScript to add and remove that class to the body element at the right times. So over in our text editor, in our theme folder, let's jump into our JavaScript and then modules folder. And let's open up search.js. And if we want to do something as soon as the overlay is opened, we can just write a bit of code within our open overlay method. So right after this line of code where we add a class to the overlay div, let's just use jQuery to target the main body element, right? The element that all HTML content lives within. And then let's give it a class. So add class. And the class name is body-no scroll. So I've already written a CSS class with this name that will tell the element to use overflow hidden, which will remove the ability to scroll. So let's save that. And then over in the browser, you'll notice as soon as I open up the search overlay, I'm scrolling my mouse wheel, but nothing happens. Perfect. However, once I close the search overlay, now I'm still unable to scroll. And that doesn't make much sense, right? So as soon as someone closes the overlay, let's just go ahead and remove that class that we just added to the body element. So within our close overlay method, let's add a new line, target the body element, and let's just remove a class instead of adding one with the same name, body no scroll. Okay, so now when you first load the page, you can scroll. Open up the search overlay, you can no longer scroll, but as soon as you close it, it's back to normal. Okay, now let's change gears. The next thing I want to work on is keyboard shortcuts to open and close the overlay. So I think it would be cool if you could press the S key on your keyboard, S for search, and that would open up the overlay. And then it would be nice if you could press the escape key on your keyboard to close the overlay. So let's jump back into our JavaScript and make that happen. Let's begin by focusing on our events area, right? Because we want to respond to the event of a key being pressed. Now with our previous events, these on-click events, we were only interested in the click event if a very particular element was getting clicked on. But in this case of a key being pressed on a keyboard, it's not like we want a particular element to be aware of it. We want the entire page or browser in general to be on the lookout for key presses. So here's what we can do. On a new line within our events method, let's use jQuery to select the main document object. And this is the web browser's model of the entire current page. All right, and then that is what we can use the jQuery on method with. So just like we did up on these two lines, the on method takes two arguments. The first is the event that you want to be on the lookout for. So in this case, instead of click, let's go with key up. And that's when a user releases or lifts up off a key that they just pressed down. We will learn about key down a bit later on, but for now, let's go with key up. Okay, and then the second argument is the function or method that we want to call in response. So just like on these two lines, we began with this to look at the current object, and then we can look inside it for the name of one of our methods, right? The methods are the actions that live down here. So down here, let's say this dot, and then we get to make up a name for a method that we are going to create in about 10 seconds from now. So the name doesn't matter, I'm just going to make something up. Why don't we call it key press dispatcher. And then while we're at it, why don't we use bind this so that within this method, the keyword of this refers back to our main object. So right after this dot keypress dispatcher, let's say dot bind this. Okay, now we said that this is the name of the method that we want to call when this happens, so we better actually go and create a method with this name. So down here in our methods area, let's just create a brand new method named keyPress dispatcher, parentheses, curly brackets. And before we worry about doing anything truly useful, why don't we add a bit of a test here, just to make sure things are working. Why don't we say console.log, this is how we can output a test message into the browser, console.log, and within the parentheses, let's say this is a test. Okay, so let's go ahead and save this, and then over in the browser, I want you to open up the JavaScript console. If you're using Google Chrome, you can always just click View up in the top menu, and then under the Developer menu, you can choose JavaScript console. Another way to open the console, and this works in almost every browser, not just Google Chrome, you can right-click anywhere on the page and choose Inspect, and then within the pop-up Developer Tools window, just choose the Console tab. Okay, so here's my JavaScript console, and I'm going to resize my web browser window so we can see the console in the background. And if I click back anywhere onto the main browser window and press a key on my keyboard, oh, looks like it's not working. Aha, I see the problem. So when we say on the key up event, the U in the word up should be lowercase instead of uppercase. Sorry about that. So key up, all lowercase. Let's save that again. And now if I press a key on my keyboard, cool, we see our console.log. This is a test message. All right, so now that we are successfully responding to the event of a key being pressed, now we need to get more specific within our keyPress dispatcher method, right? Because we are not interested in just any key being pressed. We are only interested in the S key and the escape key, right? S for search should open the search overlay, and then the escape key should close the overlay. So the question becomes, how do we differentiate between different key presses in JavaScript? Well, the answer is something called a key code. So in JavaScript, every key on your keyboard has a unique numerical key code. So the question is, what is the numerical key code for the S key on our keyboard? Well, we could just go Google it, or I could tell you that it's the number 83, but I want to show you a practical way that you can find out any key code number for yourself. So in JavaScript, when we're looking out for the key up or key down event, when JavaScript calls this function in response, it's going to pass along a bit of information about the key press event into this function. So down here within the signature for that function, within the parentheses, we can make up a parameter name. So the name doesn't matter. We could say event, or we could even just say the letter E so it's easy to type. But now within the body of this method, we can look inside this parameter to find the information that got passed along about the specific key press event. So for example, we can look inside that parameter, and it has a property named key code. And this is the numerical code for whichever key on your keyboard was pressed. So just as a test, let's delete this, but inside our console log test message, instead of outputting a string of text, why don't we output e.keycode? So now if I save this and go back to the browser, if I press the S key, we can see 83. If I press the escape key, we see 27. And you could press any other key on your keyboard to find out the key code for whatever you're interested in, right? So if you want to find the key code for the letter B, just press B. You can see it's 66. If you're interested in the letter Z, press it. You can see it's 90. Okay, but back to our specific task. We are interested in the S and the escape key. So again, the letter S is 83. So back within our key dispatcher method, let's do this. Underneath this test line, let's use an if statement. So let's say only if parentheses, curly brackets. And let's say only if the key that was just pressed has a key code of 83, which is the S key, only then do we want to fire the open overlay method in response. So for the if condition, we can just say if e.keycode equals 83. Remember that when you're checking for equality, it's equal sign, two of them, instead of just a single equal sign that we use when we are asserting equality, right? Like when you assign a value to a variable. So if the key that was pressed is the S key, then inside of the body for this if statement, let's just call and run our open overlay method. So we can just say this dot open overlay in parentheses to actually call the function. Okay, let's go ahead and save that and give it a test. So I will press the S key on my keyboard. Perfect, it opened up the overlay. Now let's do the same thing for the escape key in closing the overlay. So right now if you press the escape key, you can see that it has a numerical code of 27. So back in our function, right below this if statement, let's just create another if statement and say if parentheses curly brackets. For the condition, we'll say if e.keycode equals 27, then fire the close method. So this dot close overlay. Let's give that a save. S key to open it, escape key to close it. Perfect. Except you might notice that if you press down the S key and hold it down without letting go of it, you'll notice that our overlay doesn't open until you actually let go of the key. Now that's not a big deal, but it can create a little bit of a laggy feeling because the event doesn't fire as soon as you press the key, but instead a few milliseconds later when you let go of the key. Now the reason we are seeing this behavior is because we chose to use the web browser's key up event. The key up event is the moment when a key is released or let go of, whereas the key down event happens the millisecond that you first press down on a key. However, there's another key difference between key up and key down. Key up will only fire once, but key down will fire again and again and again as long as you hold down the key. Now every browser is different. Some might fire the event every 5 milliseconds or every 500 milliseconds, but let me show you what I'm talking about. So if we set this to key down, save it and give it another try, if I hold down on the S key without letting go of it, you'll notice that the overlay opens immediately, but as I'm holding down the S key, notice that that event just keeps firing again and again and again. You can see the count going up. And if I press down the escape key and keep holding it down, you can see the same thing. Right? So it looks like key down is firing multiple times per second if you just keep holding down on the key. Now in this particular example, nothing bad is happening by running that event again and again and again. It's not a very costly event to run, so it's not like it's going to freeze someone's web browser. However, I don't want us to get in the bad habit of writing code that could potentially lock up the browser. Right? There's no need to run the same method again and again and again like this. So why don't we write a bit of code so that you can only close the overlay if it's currently open, and you can only open the overlay if it's currently closed. So that way, even if someone holds down a key and fires the key down event again and again and again, we won't actually be calling our open and close methods needlessly. The appropriate method will be called once as needed, and this way we never risk overloading or freezing a web browser. Now, in order to test this out, why don't we do this? Why don't we go ahead and delete this console log message where we output the key code of what's being pressed. We no longer need that now that we know the codes for the S and escape key. So let's delete that line. And then just as a test, within our open and close methods, why don't we output a message so that we can see each time the method is being ran? So within our open overlay method, let's console.log and say our open method just ran. And then we can do the same thing in our close overlay. So at the end of this method, just run console.log and let's say our close method just ran. So now if we save that and I hold down the S key, without letting go of it, we can see that that method just keeps getting fired again and again and again. So now we can clearly see what we are trying to avoid. So all we need to do now is up within our keyPressDispatcher method, when we say only if the key code that's being pressed is 83, only then should you fire this method, we just want to add on another condition within these parentheses to say only if the key is 83 and if the overlay is not already open. So we could technically use jQuery here to check to see if the main overlay div has a class of search overlay active, but reading from the DOM is very, very slow in comparison to just reading from a JavaScript variable or property. So in order to keep your code as fast as possible, you should always avoid dealing with the DOM if at all possible. So instead of using jQuery here to check if a div has a certain class, why don't we go up into our constructor function and let's create a new property that stores a little bit of information about the state of the overlay. So this dot, let's create a new property and let's name it isOverlayOpen. I just made up this name. You could choose whatever you want, but let's set its default or starting value to false, right? Because when you first come to the page, the overlay is not open. And now we can just change the value of this property anytime our open or close methods run. So down within our open overlay method, at the end of this method, let's just adjust that property. So this dot is overlay open. Let's set it to true, right? Because after this method runs, the overlay will be open. Set it to true, and then in our close function or close method, let's set it to false. This dot is overlay open equals false. Cool. So now within our keyPressDispatcher, within our if statements, instead of looking at the DOM to see if that div has a class, we can just check our property, which is lightning fast. So we only want to open the overlay if it's currently closed. So we can just say if the key code that was pressed is 83 and just 2 ampersand symbols, and if this dot is overlay open, if that is false. So you could say equals false, but another way of doing it is you can just place an exclamation point or exclamation mark right before it. So altogether, only if the key that was just pressed is 83 and if the overlay is not currently open, then run open overlay. Let's do the same thing for the escape key. So only if the escape key was pressed and if the overlay is currently open, do we want to be able to close it. So we can just say this dot is overlay open, right? And if that property is set to true, this will evaluate to true. So now if we save this and go back to the browser, if I press the S key and keep holding it down, you'll notice that that method does not get ran again and again. It just runs once. Cool, and if I press and hold the escape key, it also only runs once. And that's actually going to bring this lesson to a close. In our next lesson, we will learn how to manage time in JavaScript. So for example, when someone starts searching for biology, we don't want to send a search request when all they've typed in is the letter B. So we don't want to send a search request as soon as someone starts or stops typing. Instead, why don't we wait until they've paused or stopped typing for maybe 800 milliseconds or a full second. So for example, when they type in B, that would start a timer, but then if they type in another letter, it would reset the timer, and it would just continue on like that until they indeed finish typing and pause. This way, we avoid flooding the WordPress server with requests that don't even make sense, right? We don't actually want to search the WordPress database for B or BIO. You get the idea. So we will learn how to manage time, how to work with timers, and then in the lesson after that, we will learn how to talk to the WordPress database and retrieve real content in real time, on the fly. This is going to be a ton of fun. Let's keep things rolling, and I will see you in the next lesson. Hello, everyone. In this lesson, we will continue to work on our live search results JavaScript. To be more specific, when someone opens up the overlay and actually begins typing into this input field, we want to respond to that event of them typing, but as we discussed in our previous lesson, we don't want to send a search request off to the WordPress server the millisecond someone types in a letter here, right? So for example, if someone was going to search for math, well, when they very first press the M key, we want our JavaScript to wait a second, right? We don't actually want to search the WordPress database for M. So what we're going to do is every time a user types a letter in here, we can begin a countdown or a timer, maybe to 800 milliseconds or 3/4 of a second. And then as soon as they type in another letter, we can reset that clock so the countdown starts over again. And then once they finally finish typing whatever it is they're typing and they pause for a split second, then at that moment we can use our JavaScript to send off this search request to the WordPress server. And then we can display the results right here, right? So any programs or professors, campuses, or events that have to do with math. But first things first, before we worry about managing time in JavaScript, let's first begin by just responding to this event at all, right? The event of a key being pressed on a keyboard while this text field is focused. So right now, let's get started by jumping into our text editor. And in our theme folder, let's go into the JavaScript folder and then modules. And let's open up search.js. And if we want to be on the lookout for an event, we can just write a new bit of code within our events section. Right? Each one of these lines represents a different event that we're on the lookout for. So why don't we just add a new line? And we can look to the line right above it for inspiration, right? Because the event of pressing down a key on your keyboard is still the event that we are looking for this time around. But the big difference here is the element that we want to attach this event listener to. In this line of code, we chose the page as a whole or the document object. So no matter where you are on the page or what you've clicked on or given focus to, the key down event will still be registered. Well, in this new line of code that we're going to write, we don't want to target the page as a whole. Instead, we want to target just this one text field element that users can type into. We want to add the key down event listener to this specific single element. So we can begin this line of code by using jQuery to select that element. I can't remember the class or ID of that element off the top of my head, but if we jump into our footer.php file and scroll down to the very bottom, remember this is where we wrote that little bit of search overlay HTML. So here's the input element, the text field, and you'll see that we gave it an ID of search-term. So back in our JavaScript, we can select that element by saying hashtag to look for an ID and then just type it out, search-term. Okay, so now that we've got that one element, we can just use the jQuery on method. So this takes two arguments. The first is the name of the event. So instead of click, we're going to use key down again. And then the second argument is a function that you want to run in response. So the name of this function does not matter. We get to make a name up. We're actually just going to call one of our methods. So before we make up a name here, down in the methods section, why don't we create a brand new method where we make up a name? We could call it whatever we want, but why don't we call it typing logic? Right? Because this method is going to contain all of our logic for waiting 800 milliseconds before continuing on. Okay, so we will build out this method a bit later on, but back up here on this new event line, for the second argument, now we can just point towards that new method. So this to look inside our object, and then dot, and then the name of that method. So typing logic. Now before we save this and test it out in the browser, let's do a couple of things. So first, instead of selecting the search field element right here with jQuery, why don't we instead select the element up in our constructor and create a property just like we did for the open button and the close button and the overlay div itself. Right, let's do that same thing for the search field element. My reasoning for wanting to do that is I know that we are going to need to access this element again and again. And remember that accessing the DOM, the web browser's document object model, is very slow compared to the lightning fast speed of JavaScript reading its own properties. So what I'm proposing is up here in the constructor, You could add a new line right below this at the very bottom, or to stay organized and keep all of the elements near each other, you could add a new line here. And let's create a new property. So this dot, and we could name it whatever we want. Why don't we call it search field, and then just set it to equal this jQuery selector that we already wrote. So I'm just going to copy that into my clipboard, and then in its place have X as a temporary placeholder. And then up in the constructor, set this new property to equal, paste in our clipboard, add a semicolon at the end. Cool, so now down here, instead of the temporary placeholder X, we can just reference this property. So we can just say this dot search field, and then we can call the on method on that property. So this way we have this reusable variable that points towards that element, instead of us needing to touch the DOM again and again and again, which can be slow. Cool. Now before we save this, one last thing I want to do is inside our typing logic method, why don't we add just a quick test? So we can alert maybe just a pop-up message that says, hello from typing logic. Right? Just so we can test things out and make sure that it's working. So at this point, let's go ahead and save this. And make sure that you have gulp watch running in the command line, right? So your JavaScript will get rebundled up. And then let's go over to the browser and test this. So open up the overlay, and as soon as I start typing in a letter, cool, we see that annoying alert message, hello from typing logic. So that means our code is working properly. Now let's learn how to manage and work with time in JavaScript, right? Because we don't actually want to do something the millisecond a key is pressed down on that text field. So within our typing logic method, let's delete this alert test line. And instead, I want to show you how we can wait a little while in JavaScript before doing something. So just as an extreme example, let's imagine we wanted to wait a full 2 seconds after the event happens and this method runs. So within the method, we can use something in JavaScript called setTimeout. setTimeout takes 2 arguments. The first argument is a function that you want to run. I'm just going to say X as a temporary placeholder. And then the second argument is how many milliseconds you want to wait before running that function. So if we wanted to wait 2 seconds, that's 2,000 in terms of milliseconds. Now back to the function that we want to run after this amount of time has passed. You're free to type out the name of a function here, right? A function that has been defined somewhere else, like one of our methods. Or you can always just create an anonymous function right in place here. So to create an anonymous function, we can delete that temporary placeholder, and you just type out the word function, and then parentheses, and then curly brackets. Right? So instead of including the name of a function that points somewhere else, you could just create a function right in place. And then within the curly brackets, let's log out a message to the console as a test. So we could say console.log. And for the message, we could say, this is a timeout test. Okay, let's go ahead and save that. And now back in the browser, I'm going to open up the JavaScript console so I can see if that test message is coming through. So click onto console. And I'm going to resize my main browser window so I can see the console window at the same time. Cool. Okay, so let me open up the search overlay. Remember, we still have those open and close test messages from our previous lesson whenever you open or close the overlay. But as soon as I click onto the text field and press a letter on my keyboard, you'll notice that nothing happens immediately. Instead, the browser waits a full 2 seconds, and then it shows us this test message. So cool, that means our setTimeout is working as intended. However, let's not forget the entire reason we wanted to add a pause or a timer in the first place. Remember, we didn't want to flood the WordPress server with random or short, meaningless search strings. So pretend that where we are logging this test message out to the console, pretend that this is where we are actually going to send a request to the WordPress server. Now what I mean by this is if I just press one letter, right? So if I type in the letter A now, we see the number 2 here to signify that that has been ran twice. And if I type in another letter, we see this goes up to 3, right? Because this is ran 3 times. However, watch what happens even if I type very rapidly like you would normally do. So if I come to the website and search for biology, whoa, we see that it climbs all the way to 12. And this is because at the moment, the way our code is set up, every time we press a key, it's going to fire this method, and each time that's going to create a new unique timeout, right? Each one of those timers with each key press is its own entity. So if I go back and refresh the page and open up the search, if I type in biology, that will take me 7 keystrokes, right? And there we see 7. And this is not what we truly want. We wouldn't want to send 7 different requests to the WordPress server. Or in other words, we don't want to create 7 different timers or 7 different timeouts that are all independent of each other. Instead, why don't we work with just one single timeout, and then we can clear or reset that timer each time this method runs. So let me show you what I mean. Instead of just having this set timeout floating in outer space, what we can do up in our constructor is create a new property. So we just say this dot, and then we can make up whatever name we want. Why don't we go with typing timer? And we don't even need to set it to equal a value. We can literally just declare this as a property. And now down in our typing logic method, instead of creating an unnamed set timeout that's just sort of floating in outer space, why don't we say this dot typing timer equals a set timeout? This way we are giving this timeout or timer a name that we can access, right? We are assigning it to this property or variable. Now check this out. Right above this line, still within the typing logic method, we can use another tool in JavaScript named clear timeout. And this is how you can reset a timeout or timer. So now within the parentheses for clear timeout, we can just use the name of our property, this dot typing timer. So this way, every time we press a key while we are in that search field, we know that this method is going to run, and the first thing we do is clear or reset the timer. So for example, maybe it had been 1.5 seconds since the last time we had pressed down a key. So that would mean that there was only 500 milliseconds left on this countdown of 2000. So this way we are resetting that, or I should say we are basically getting rid of that timeout or timer. The timer that was going to expire or execute in 500 milliseconds, we are saying, nope, forget about it. Okay, and then right after that, we are just reestablishing a timeout that will execute this code in 2000 milliseconds from now. Cool, now before we save this and test it out in the browser, we do need to talk a little bit about the keyword this. Right, because the this keyword is what's allowing us to reference this variable that lives within our constructor, or I should say this property that lives within our constructor. So down within our typing logic method, in order to access the properties and methods of this object, we are counting on the this keyword pointing towards our object. However, remember this function is being called by this event handler, and by default the on method is going to set the value of the this keyword to equal whatever element triggered the event. So in this case, at this very moment, within this method, the this keyword is pointing towards the main text input field instead of our object. Now to fix this, that's why we've been using .bind this on all of our function calls. So for this search field keydown event, when we call this method, let's just be sure to add on .bind this. Cool, now at this point, let's save this and take our clear timeout reset functionality for a spin. What we are hoping to see is that this code will not be executed for every single key press. Instead, only when someone has truly waited 2000 milliseconds in between key presses would we hope to see this code. So back in the browser, let's open up the search overlay. And if I start typing in biology at just a regular typing speed, perfect. Our code waited until there was a 2-second gap after a keystroke, and then our code ran only once. And that's exactly what we want. And that's actually going to bring this lesson to a close. In our next lesson, we will continue working towards being able to pull in real data from the WordPress database. So instead of this test message, we will send a request to WordPress, and then we will even display the results right here for the visitor. Let's keep things rolling, and I will see you in the next lesson. Hello, everyone. In this lesson, we are going to continue working on our live search results JavaScript. Okay, so the first thing that I want to work on is if someone opens up the search overlay, and after they type something in and then pause for a second or two, instead of waiting 2,000 milliseconds to output this test message to the console, instead, why don't we practice outputting real HTML content into this area of the overlay, right? Because that's where we want the real search results to be displayed. Now, before we worry about JavaScript, why don't we first make sure that we have an empty HTML div that's positioned to sit right about here. So in order to edit the HTML for the search overlay, let's jump into our text editor and open up footer.php. And down at the very bottom of this file, remember we added this search overlay div. Okay, now right below this inner search overlay top div, so right below this, but still within the overall search overlay outer div, let's drop down and create a brand new div and give it a class of container. And then within this div, let's create another div and give it an ID of search overlay __ results. The name doesn't matter, I'm just making this up so that it's something unique we can target in our JavaScript. For now, just as a quick test, if you type hello123 and go and refresh the page, and there we see it. Cool, so let's delete that hello test message from the HTML so that this div is completely empty. And instead, let's use JavaScript to add content to this div after the 2,000 millisecond delay has passed. So right now, let's jump into our JavaScript folder and then modules and into the search.js file. And let's begin by creating a new property in our constructor that selects that new empty div that we just created. So in the constructor function, maybe at the very top of it, we can just say this dot, and then we can make up whatever name we want. I'm going to call it results div and set it to equal, so $ parentheses to use jQuery. And then for the selector, we use hashtag to select by the ID. And remember, we gave it an ID of search overlay __ results. Okay, now next, let's scroll down to our typing logic method. Remember, this is where we created the set timeout or timer that's going to wait 2,000 milliseconds after a keystroke before running this code, right? This is what's logging out to the console. This is a timeout test. So now, instead of logging out a message to the console, we want to output content into that empty results div. So we could write code right within this anonymous function to add content to that div, right? We could delete this console.log line. But in the name of staying organized and writing clean code, instead of using an anonymous inline function like this, why don't we delete that? Remember, set timeout takes 2 arguments. The first is a function that you want to run, and then how long you want to wait. So instead of spelling out the function right in place here, why don't we create a brand new method right below this? And let's name this new method getResults, parentheses, curly brackets. Okay, and then let's tell our timeout to call that method once the time has passed. So for the first argument, we can just say this dot get results. And then while we're at it, why don't we tack on dot bind this so that we can access our object's properties and methods from within the get results method. Now, a bit later on within this method is where we will actually make a request to the WordPress server. But for now, let's just try to output some sample text into that empty results div. So remember, we can access that empty div with this new property we created up in the constructor. The name is results div. So down in our new method, we can say this dot results div, And then we can edit the HTML for that div by using the jQuery method named HTML. And then within the parentheses, let's just say quotes, imagine real search results here. Okay, let's go ahead and save that and test it out. Open up the search overlay, type in a bit of text, and then 2,000 milliseconds later, we see imagine real search results here. So that works, but in my opinion, the user experience is quite bad because there's this big gap in time from when the user starts typing until they finally see some sort of feedback here. So what I propose instead is the millisecond that someone types in even the very first letter, we should display a spinning loader icon animation right here in that empty results div, and then once our getResults method finally runs, this text can replace the spinning loader animation. So let me show you what I mean. Back in our code, within our typing logic method, right above this line where we create the timeout, and right below this clear timeout line, let's add a new line, and let's just target that empty results div, so this dot results div, and let's just set its HTML single quotes, so that way we can use double quotes within the HTML that we want to add. And let's just add an empty div. And the important part, let's give the opening div tag a class of spinner-loader. I've already written the CSS for us that corresponds with this name. So if we go ahead and save this and jump back to the browser, let's open up the search overlay. And as soon as I press even one letter, perfect. So that way, as soon as someone types a letter, they get immediate feedback with that spinner loader icon. But we are still waiting for a pause in their typing to actually create or send off a request, right? Or in this case, display this sample text. So we're sort of getting the best of both worlds. However, you will notice that if I type in something like a full word, you'll notice that after each keystroke, the spinner animation is resetting. Right, so that looks pretty choppy. So what we should do instead is write our code in a way that we only apply this code that adds the spinner div. We only do that if it's not already being displayed. So that way we don't constantly overwrite it on each new keystroke like this. So let me show you what I mean. The way that I would achieve this is up in our constructor function, I'm going to create a new property that keeps track of the state that the spinner is currently in. Now it doesn't matter where in the constructor, but maybe right underneath this line, let's just say this dot, and then we can make up a property name. Let's call it isSpinnerVisible. And by default, let's set it to false. Okay, now down within our typing logic method, remember, this is the line of code we wrote just a moment ago that adds the spinner loader div. So let's just wrap this within an if statement. So I'm going to cut this line into my clipboard. And then in its place, I will say if parentheses, curly brackets. And the condition that I want to check for is if this dot is spinner visible. Only if that is false, meaning if it's not already visible, do I want to make it visible. So you could say if this equals false, but remember, a shorter way of checking if an item is false is you can just place an exclamation mark right before it. Okay, so only if that is false do we want to, and then just paste in your clipboard. Okay, now if this line of code is going to make the spinner visible, then right after that, still within the if statement, we should probably set that property to true. So let's say this dot is spinner visible and just set it to true. Okay, now before we save this, remember that this getResults function, this is what's going to hide the spinner once it's ready. And it's going to override the div with this little bit of text. So in other words, as soon as this line of code runs, then the spinner will no longer be visible. So right after this line of code, let's just say this dot is spinner visible and set it to false. Okay, so this way we are managing that property so we can truly trust its value in this if statement. So let's go ahead and save this and test out typing. So open up the overlay, and if I type in biology, notice that after every keystroke, the spinner icon is not resetting. So it's no longer choppy, and this is now a great experience. And once I stop typing for a second, there we see our Imagine Search Results Here message. However, you might notice that in this text field, if I even use the arrow keys on my keyboard to move my cursor around, that counts as a keystroke that will trigger the loading spinner and also try to send out another search request potentially. And the same is true with the Control key or the Shift or Windows or Command keys. So why don't we change our JavaScript so that if you press a key that doesn't actually change the search string in any way, then there's no need to trigger the loader spinner or do anything at all. Now there are a lot of different ways to code this, but what I'm going to do is up in the constructor function, I'm going to create a property that keeps track of the previous search value. So check this out. Up in the constructor, let's create a new line. Let's create a new property, so this dot, and we could name it whatever we want, but I'm going to call it previous value. And we do not need to set it to equal anything yet. We can just declare it as a property. And then down in our typing logic method, right before this method ends, so down here at the very bottom of this method, let's just update that property. So let's say this dot previous value equals, and then let's just fetch the value of the search field. So we can access our search field by saying this dot search field, because remember we created a property that points towards that element, and then we can just use the val method in jQuery, and that will give us the value. Okay, so this method is going to run after every keystroke, and we aren't updating the previous value property until the very end of this method. So up here at the very beginning of this method, why don't we write an if statement? So if parentheses, curly brackets, and for the condition, let's say only if the current value does not equal the previous value. Only if that's the case do we want to run all of this other code. So for the condition, let's say if the current value, so this dot search field dot val, and val is a function, so it gets its own parentheses. So if that value does not equal the previous value, so this dot previous value. So only if the keystroke that they just pressed actually changed the search string in some way do we want to run any of this code. So now we can just cut and paste or drag and drop this code to live within this if statement. So I'm going to select from clear timeout all the way down to our set timeout line. So basically everything except that previous value line that we wrote just a moment ago. Let's cut that into our clipboard, and then let's just paste it into this if statement. Okay, let's go ahead and save that and test it out in the browser. Open up the search for biology. Okay, and then if I press an arrow key on my keyboard, whoops, we still see the loading icon, so something's going wrong here. Aha, I know what the issue is. So it comes down to key down versus key up. In this case, we want to use key up instead of key down. So let's change this, and then I will explain why. The reason for this is because the key down event fires so immediately after a key press that it doesn't even give the search field a true chance to update its own value. In other words, when this was set to key down and then we were trying to update the previous value property with the current value, the key down event was being fired before the web browser had truly even updated the internal value for that field. So by changing the event to key up instead of key down, the web browser will have enough time, an extra couple of milliseconds, to actually register the input value. Okay, so with this change in place, let's go ahead and save, test it out one more time, open this up, search for a term, and now if I press the arrow key or the shift key or control key or any other key that doesn't actually manipulate the search string, our code is working as intended and it doesn't trigger any changes. Perfect. Now the next thing I want to work on is if someone completely deletes the search string so that the search field is empty, in that case there's no need to show the spinning loader animation. So let me put it back to biology. If someone deletes it so that there's nothing there, I think we should just immediately completely empty out the results div and reset or clear any timeouts that are currently counting down. So that way we don't potentially send a search request to WordPress for literally nothing. So in order to make that change, back in our text editor, if the keystroke in some way changed the search string, in this case hitting the backspace key on your keyboard would indeed do that, then we still want to run the clear timeout, right? Because if someone empties out the search field, we definitely do want to cancel that countdown timer. So we want this line of code to run no matter what, but right below this clear timeout line, let's drop down and write a new line of code. And let's create a new if statement. So if parentheses curly brackets. And for the condition, let's say only if the search field value is not blank. So we can say this dot search field, and then we can get its value or whatever the user has currently typed in by running the val method. And as long as the field is not completely blank, this will evaluate to true. So if that's true, then within the curly brackets, we will do something here very shortly. But if this is false, and if the field is completely blank, we want to do something different. So right after the closing curly brackets for this if statement, we can say else, curly brackets, as a backup plan, do this instead. So if the field is empty and this else code runs, let's just completely empty out the results div. So we can just say this dot results div, and we can change its HTML by running the jQuery method HTML, and then let's just set it to equal an empty pair of quotes. Now after this line of code runs, there's a 0% chance that the spinner loader icon will be visible. So right after that line, let's be sure to set this dot is spinner visible. Let's set it to equal false. Okay, and now before we save this, let's not forget about the do something comment. Instead of that comment, we just want to move this code that we were running before to live where this is. So let's cut and paste or move this. I'm going to begin by selecting from this if statement that checks to see if the spinner icon is currently visible or not. So select that if statement, and then let's also select our set timeout line. So let's cut that into our clipboard. And then up here, let's replace the do something comment by pasting in your clipboard. Let's go ahead and save that and test it out. Let's search for something. And then if I delete or empty the text field, perfect. Our results area is immediately cleared and we don't see an unnecessary loader icon. Now there's only one final remaining thing I want to take care of in this lesson. So if I close the search overlay, we can see that behind the scenes right here, I've temporarily added a test input field. Now this placement doesn't make much sense, but that's not the point. The point is that you're probably going to have a text input or a text area field somewhere else on your website, maybe on a contact us page, for example. And I want to make sure that our search module doesn't negatively affect other inputs. So for example, if I click into this field, I can start typing, right? But if I press the S key, remember that the S key is going to trigger our overlay to open. So that's really awkward and it could be frustrating for users. They think they're typing in a field, but then if they hit the S key, they accidentally open something that they weren't intending. So what I propose here to fix this is if a text area or input field currently has focus, then in that case we do not want the S keystroke to open our overlay. So what we can do back in our code is scroll down to our key press dispatcher method. And remember, this block of code is saying if the key that was just pressed has a key code of 83, which is the S key, and if the overlay is not already open, then open it. So let's just add a third condition. Right here we can say ampersand ampersand, and let's check to see if any text fields on the page are currently focused. So we can use jQuery, and we can select any inputs or comma, any text areas. And then once we've selected those, we can use the jQuery method named is and provide it an argument of quotes colon focus. So if any field is currently focused, this will evaluate to true. But if we want to check for the opposite of that, we can just put an exclamation mark right before it. Okay, and this is the perfect condition check now. All of these stars have to align in order for the overlay to be opened. So So let's save this and test it out. If I click onto this text field here and type the S key, nothing happens. But as soon as I click out of that text field and press the S key, there's the overlay. Perfect. And that's going to bring this lesson to a close. Now here's the exciting part. In our very next lesson, we are finally going to learn how to actually send a request to the WordPress server or database. Let's keep it rolling, and I will see you then.